listen to Tony's words, I'd like to introduce to you our next two participants, Nancy Jouwe, who is a cultural historian and a freelance researcher here in the Netherlands. Her work particularly looks at and have the Netherlands face up to its implicatedness in slavery and colonialism. She teaches at the Master of Fine Arts at the Utrecht School of the Arts as well as the Amsterdam College. She's also the co-founder of Frame Framed and the Mapping Slavery Project in Utrecht. Recently, she was involved with Amsterdam in the Slavernij in Oost en West publication, which was an important event here in the Netherlands and a public insertion into the public consciousness around slavery. So we are very privileged. Thank you, Nancy, for being here. I also want to just introduce, after Nancy, we will be hearing from Ruvimba Tenga, was born in Zimbabwe, and she's a board member of SWET. And as we are speaking about invisible work that women do, Ruvimba Tenga's work around activism around sex work and decriminalizing sex work is one of the most important spaces, I think, also where this work is happening. And Ruvimba, as describes herself in her bio, as seeking for all things spiritual and ancestral. She is an artist and a designer. She also uses recycled materials to design jewelry. So there's many strings to your bow, Ruvimba. So with that, I would like to humbly ask Nancy to please come into the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Carine, and thank you to all the organizers for organizing this. I want to really, it's an honor to be with you on this occasion, and I want to commend the organizers for setting up this important convo. But I also want to really stress and thank Tony Stewart's invocation, and thank you so much for, yeah, it's very touching what you did, and thank you for creating this space for us to talk through and within. Yeah, so for me, this is a nice break from actually writing and finishing up a book on the history of slavery of the city of Utrecht, where Carine and I both reside these days, right? And Carine already mentioned the book that was finished last year about the history of slavery in Amsterdam. And both books are talking about city, the history of a city, which is, I think, a very new phenomenon in the Netherlands also, that because in both cases, the municipalities actually commissioned these researches. So it's also the politicians who have now started to kind of wake up and want to hear about their implicatedness, I guess. But that's exactly also what we're speaking on in these publications. So I don't consider myself particularly well versed in talking about women and labor in the Cape Colony or the Cape or South Africa or Southern Africa specifically, but I have been an active public speaker and researcher and publicist on the Dutch history of slavery from an intersectional lens for the last sort of 10 years. So I'm very much about uncovering and also unlearning. And so I want to talk about two recent examples that I've been involved in, and Carine has already mentioned some of them. And I will obviously very much talk from a Dutch context. So I'll talk in two parts. First, I want to more generally touch upon some issues around the Dutch history of slavery from a gender perspective. And then secondly, I will share some notes on the Mapping Slavery project, which is a public history project. So the Dutch history of slavery has until very recently been seen as very separate from Dutch history proper. The two histories simply did not belong together. And with it, as we talk about in the Netherlands, as we talked about the history of slavery, it was mostly connected to the Dutch Atlantic slave trade and South America. So Brazil, Suriname, Guyana, and the Caribbean. In short, it was only related to the Dutch West India Company, which was founded in 1621, this year 400 years ago. But the history of the East India Company, which includes the Indian Ocean, Southern Africa, in relation to slavery and the Dutch, are equally important to tackle. And in the Netherlands, only a small group of descendants and some historians are familiar to this history of Indian Ocean slavery and the role of the VOC in introducing the system in South Africa, but only in 2015 with the path-breaking Dutch publications of two historians, Reggie Bai and Matthijs van Rossum, who both wrote public history books on this topic, that the story became more known to a larger audience. And I would say, but up until today, many Dutch folks still hold on to the idea that the Dutch, that to the Dutch, the Cape was just a refreshing station, the Cape Colony, and that apartheid is not really a Dutch word. And so the Dutch government decided in 2017 that we should have a national slavery museum. We don't have one as of yet. And because of this, I was asked, together with some other curators and writers and museum folks, by a Dutch daily newspaper, what would be my choice to put on show in such a museum? And so I answered, I would like to show portraits of 3 women of color living on 3 continents that were colonized by the Dutch and who were enslaved by Dutch male slave owners. Life for men and women in the colony were fundamentally different, and gender was a key category of difference together with race and class. And the lives of enslaved women shows this par excellence. And so the Njai, or the concubine in the Dutch East Indies, was an indigenous woman who had to take care of the thousands of young European men that were shipped off to Asia from the 17th century onwards. And she, the Njai, taught the Dutch men, often from a position as an enslaved person, the local language and culture. She took care of the household and was forced to take care of his sexual needs. And so this was a very convenient arrangement for the colonial regime. European women were hardly allowed in VOC territories in those early days. And the position of the Njai was precarious. At every moment she could be done away with like a piece of furniture, as inventories in the archive also show us. She had no say in the children she bore, and with changing colonial rules in the 19th century, more women coming to the Dutch East Indies, the role of the Njai also became less important, which triggered a stigma on her being promiscuous, being immoral, being called a woman with a monkey face. Once convenient, she had become a menace to the colonial balance in the Dutch East Indies. Secondly, to this newspaper, I also suggested to tell the story of Saartje Baartman. And of course, everyone here, I'm sure, is very familiar with that story. But Saartje Baartman's story is still so unknown to many Dutch folks, whereas it so aptly summarizes the cruelty of the colonial system, the links between the colony and the metropole, the connection between gender, race, sexuality, and how ideas about race dominated Europe in the 19th century. A third woman that I would have proposed to see in the museum, which, by the way, doesn't exist as of yet, would be Sojourner Truth, who was born in 1797 and lived in New Netherland, now known as the state of New York in the USA, where she was the property of a Dutch owner until she was 9 and where she spoke Dutch. And her next owner beat her so severely for not speaking English properly And this woman would become 6 feet tall and an influential free Black public speaker and an abolitionist who also spoke out on women's rights and who had sussed out the court system in such a way that she was able to also free her enslaved son. And so the stories of these women show us that the Dutch history of slavery is a global history that spans 4 continents and at least 3 centuries. And the magnitude is enormous, but the life stories of these women make these histories also tangible and human. It also shows the complex and degrading intersections between race, gender, class, and sexuality, which were guiding principles in European colonial empires. And because the Dutch know so shockingly little about their own colonial history, and especially the history of slavery, we started the project Mapping Slavery. And so now I'm entering the second part of my talk. So Mapping Slavery is a research project initiated in 2013 at the Vrije Universiteit, Free University in Amsterdam, by Dienke Honlius, who teaches history there. And it comprises of an aggregation of practices that both Black and white women, historians and cultural heritage professionals were involved in. And so central to Mapping Slavery as a public history project is the mapping and thus visualizing of the Dutch history of slavery as it unfolds in the Dutch metropole and also its former colonies. And so considering the Dutch colonial empire in Asia, Africa, and the Americas as one analytical entity, and the Dutch colonial project and its afterlife as a continuum through connecting colonial history and current race relations, a very under-researched topic in the Netherlands, are premise starting points within the project. And so our work involves empirical research and methods such as reading the city as an archive and mapping. Two of several founding elements for the Mapping Slavery came from the Dutch cities of Utrecht and Amsterdam. And so in Utrecht, I worked as a curator in public spaces, indoors and outdoors, such as libraries, municipal corridors, even shops, churches, streets even. And I started a 2-year project called Traces of Slavery in Utrecht in 2011, and worked together with historian Esther Captain from the Center of Humanities, which is a partner in the project. So a walking tour was launched in 2011 through the city of Utrecht that told that story, and Captain also published an accompanying walking guide. The project in Utrecht was very much an intervention because Utrecht was not associated at all with the history of slavery. This part of history is typically related to Amsterdam. And so the guidebook by Esther Captain and our overall project became one of the blueprints for the Mapping Slavery project. The second element was the work of Jennifer Tosh, and some of you are quite familiar. I know Tony Stewart has worked with Jennifer Tosh. She started the Black Heritage Amsterdam tours in 2013 in the city center of Amsterdam. And through her storytelling and walking past numerous streets, monuments, and buildings, a new layer of Dutch and Amsterdam history unfolds, which even to Dutch ears and eyes is quite surprising to many. And Tosh teaches people to look at Amsterdam anew. And so both Tosh and I are navigating the city, reading the city as an archive in order to narrate a story that was coated in silence. As Black women, we, or women of color, depending on how you would read that notion in a particular context, we did public interventions who were narrating a different story, while embodying the story that we were telling at the same time. The storytelling and navigation through the city is an embodied practice. Our bodies are connected to the stories and therefore mostly not experienced as quote unquote neutral or objective in ways white people supposedly can practice neutrality or objectivity on this topic in the Netherlands. And simultaneously, we both purposely position ourselves in the story. Positioning, which is often a scary or difficult concept for many white Dutch people, is done in order to emphasize the importance of locating oneself in this larger story. So in our work for mapping slavery, we map, we research, we narrate and visualize material and immaterial traces of the history of slavery in the Netherlands. The research we do is both empirical, as we look into written and visual archival material, which often also entails reading against the grain, as Anne Stoler puts it, which means, you have to understand how the archive is organized. It's not organized to cater us, obviously. But we also look at the city, as I mentioned earlier. We view the city as an archive. We try to read its traces in monuments, gable stones, tombstones in churches, graveyards even. And these stories and traces are translated into data for physical and digital maps, including text entries, which can function as a baseline for published guidebooks, walking tours through the city, but also theater productions and podcasts. And as such, our work has involved multiple layers of both thinking, but also producing. The act of mapping is important because of the visualization it involves. We make something tangible that has been silenced and was rendered invisible for a long time. Instead, we create our own counter map. Mapping was an important aspect of the colonial project. In the 17th century, the work of map makers was a crucial technology necessary to understand, navigate, and conquer the world. And what was not mapped in those days were the violent migratory movements that more than 1 million Asian and African people endured under Dutch control. They were enslaved, sold, bought, transported, and held by the Dutch during colonial times from the early 17th or even 16th century up until the late 19th century. And there was a silence in the daily rhetoric of the Dutch mainstream and an absence in the Dutch historical accessible knowledge production on the centuries-long involvement in colonial slavery by the Dutch. And yet there were all these visual remnants which often remained unseen. And so by gathering empirical data and mapping them into visual and narrated stories, mapping slavery debunks the notion of Dutch colonialism, including slavery, having taken place somewhere else, out of sight and therefore out of mind, hardly a part of Dutch history. Well into the 21st century, slavery was not considered an integral part of Dutch history. And even if it was, Dutch people often refer to it as being a mere black page in a larger colonial story, which would actually brought the Dutch a lot of good, originating from a great Dutch character trait, the VOC mentality, which stands for going out, being innovative, and being pioneering, and being good in business. Trade. As we map, we are filling in the colonial blankness in Dutch space onto the Dutch map, into our Dutch canon, refusing to hail the golden age. And this is quite necessary because in March 2020, which is exactly a year ago, YouGov, which is a UK-based research company, conducted research in 7 European countries and Japan, and they concluded, YouGov, concluded that 50% of the Dutch are still quite proud of their colonial heritage. And this was the highest percentage of the countries that were researched, even higher than the Brits. And so for many Dutch folks, the question ultimately remains, how is mapping in the metropole useful when where plantations did not exist? How does it help us in understanding slavery and our implicatedness in it? And as an aspiration, mapping can be understood as moving towards something that is of yet cannot be seen. It's a moving towards freedom. And in the USA, a map towards freedom was often literal, making a counter map in order to escape the enslaver, following the Underground Railroad to the north. So the book Beloved by Toni Morrison can be seen as a fugitive mapping, for instance. And so in the Netherlands now, we can use mapping as a road to freedom metaphorically, hopefully, aspiring to be free from denial, guilt, and ignorance of our colonial past towards knowing, experiencing, seeing, and towards accountability of that history. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That is beautiful. I think it is interesting to understand the work that you're doing in the Netherlands and making visible there, also in relation to what Undercover of Darkness is trying to do to make visible in the kind of Cape context and South African context, because in both directions there's been kind of made invisible and made naturalized in quite worrying ways. And I think that's also a lovely way to why we call the session gathering is this is where we're gathering, this is the point from which we are looking, this is this acknowledgement, this is this being able to actually look at what we are looking at these legacies and actually making them visible.